This is a video on the confessions of sex abuse of prolific science fiction author Isaac Asimov. Amazon is going to be, my understanding, making a series of his foundation novels, which are perhaps his most popular science fiction books. But in the 70s, he published the first of three autobiographies. This one covers 1920 to 1924, called In Memory Yet Green. It was obviously reviewed, but as far as I can tell, none of the reviewers touched upon the most important part of this autobiography, which are his confessions of sex abuse. Also, there are some interesting allusions to a secret and not so secret gay life and desires he had. Isaac Asimov died of HIV in the 90s, AIDS, and his family initially covered that up, or it was not reported. I believe it was reported that he died of a heart problem. A few years later, my understanding is his daughter did reveal that he, in fact, died of HIV through a blood transfusion. However, I'm going to explain why I think it's actually very probable that Isaac Asimov had a, sadly, secret, in-the-closet gay lifestyle, and this is all based on what he writes in this book. It's possible that his in-the-closet gay lifestyle is an explanation for his hostility and sex abuse of women. Maybe there was some sort of strange psychological issue going on with him where he had an anger towards women because he was in a conventional marriage, raising a kid, but probably in some sort of neurotic fashion, unable to cope with that. I'll explain all this and point to page numbers. So why has no one else talked about this? Well, I think one reason is this autobiography is over 700 pages. It's out of print. If you want to get a copy that's in any good shape, it becomes rather pricey. There are some beat-up volumes you can buy. Also, on itself, even though Isaac Asimov says he's going to be very candid in this book, it's rather dull reading. While he was in high school, he started keeping a diary, and basically this autobiography is a transcription of that diary. The result is that there's no overarching narrative. There's certainly no self-reflection or self-analysis, so it does become rather tedious. On the other hand, Asimov makes plain at the beginning that he's going to be perfectly candid because, in my view, he's probably a pathological narcissist, or was since he died. As he says on the book, his most fascinating subject is himself. And this is a guy who comes across as extremely thin-skinned, who holds grudges over minor things. Now I'm going to give you an example which is quite extraordinary in terms of its foreshadowing, because he died of, as I said, HIV, AIDS in the 90s. There is an episode he refers to multiple times in this book where he gives blood as a donor. I believe he's B-type blood, and someone in the line asks him what blood type he is, and he tells them, and the other person says, well, I have the best blood, I'm a type O, which is a universal donor. Isaac Asimov writes that infuriated him, because how dare that person say that his type O blood was better than Asimov's type B blood. Asimov is not saying this in jest. He says that he to this day, when he wrote the book, he's still furious at the guy for insinuating that his blood is better. Of course, the ultimate irony being, in the foreshadowing, being that he died of AIDS, a blood disease. Now, why would Asimov's doctors and obviously family with the making the ultimate decision, and Asimov himself, not disclose that he had HIV/AIDS? Especially when you consider that Asimov was a scientist, and what an opportunity it would have been for him to say, look, I caught this virus, it's terrible, but this is what it is. Because unfortunately and terribly, there was an awful stigma that went with having HIV/AIDS, as there was so much fear at the time he had it. And instead, he covered it up. Well, throughout this book, Asimov infers a very strong gay attraction, an attraction to men. And as an example, he writes about when he was in college, there was a guy who he spent all his time with. He would arrange his entire life every day around a fellow male student. And Asimov writes that people thought that he must be gay. And a teacher mentioned that. And how insulted Asimov was. How dare they even think that? And yet, well, it's great. He had a male friend. But then he has another couple of incidents that he talks about where he discloses that every time he got drunk, I guess he thinks this is funny, he would start reaching out to his male friends and telling them again and again, I love you, and trying to hug them and get physically affectionate with them. Interesting, because maybe that discloses his real feelings. Then there's yet another episode where he is, eventually he moves to Boston, and he goes to this gay nightclub, and he says how beautiful he thought there were transvestites at the club, and he was completely enamored with the transvestites, and says that in the book he writes, perhaps, here he says, I could almost believe I married the wrong sex. So ultimately, Asimov ends up in Boston, and he's teaching at Boston University Medical Center, and that is on the edge of what's known, or was known at the time, as the combat zone. The combat zone is essentially a very rough red light district of Boston. At the end of the book, Asimov writes that he was becoming increasingly promiscuous. Now he was becoming famous, promiscuous with women. He goes into a great detail of that, picking up one of his students who brought a girlfriend, and he attributes his promiscuity to being a great lover. Of course, that plays into his narcissism. But this was a short, fat guy who he writes had boils on him as a pre-diabetic. I think unlikely that the women were attracted to him for his prowess. The bottom line is, I think it's highly likely that he, based on the reading of this book, he contracted HIV/AIDS from either a promiscuous relationship with a woman or from trying out, experimenting, or having a gay relationship. But let's talk about the confessions of sex abuse. And there's an example that I want to give here. There are many, many examples. Asimov writes that he prided himself on being lecherous, and he would leer at women, and that's his personality, and he was very proud of it. Throughout the book, he talks about that. Here an example is, this is one of many of his interactions with women. Leading the pack was Betty, I don't remember her last name, who was a sweet and pretty girl, large and busty. My clearest memory of her is my having once snapped the back elastic of her bra through her blouse. A very bad habit I sometimes can't resist to this day. And it broke. Betty had to rush off to the ladies' room to make the necessary repairs. When she came back, she brushed aside my voluble and embarrassed apologies. Doesn't matter, she said, and wasn't the least annoyed. I was very fond of her after that. To me, this reads not only as sex abuse, but there's a hostility there. Snapping the bra of a woman, it's quite unbelievable. Where does that hostility come from? I surmise that it may have been a result of his actually being gay in the closet and having some sort of neurotic misogyny, anger, hatred towards women, perhaps because he was in a conventional relationship. He was married to a very loving woman who actually saved his life, and nonetheless, he cheated on her and had absolutely no compassion or empathy for her, as far as one can read in this book. And as another example, there is a woman who basically here, she calls him Mr. Hands, and writes that Asimov felt obliged to leer, ogle, pat, and proposition as an act of sociability. Asimov was known as Mr. Hands. Women were warned when he would come to the publishing house that he would be there, that they could move away ahead of time, be forewarned that he was known, he would grope them, kiss them, pat their behinds. So, and he writes about that throughout this book. So those are the confessions of Isaac Asimov, confessions of his sex abuse, and I think some of the reasons and foundation, not only a pathological narcissist, but also a real misogyny, which may be based on a disturbed psyche, living in the closet as a frustrated gay man. So, a sad person in a sad life, Isaac Asimov.